The story you're about to hear isn't a lecture. It's a guided walk through a world where private life was anything but private. Imagine waking up in a society where your most personal abilities could be questioned in a courtroom, where officials kept records not of your taxes or your trade, but of your suitability for marriage. It sounds absurd, yet for centuries that was ordinary life. What we think of as privacy simply hadn't been invented. Communities judged, recorded, and debated matters that today would never leave a doctor's office. And if you think this is exaggeration, remember, for our ancestors, reputation was currency. A single failure in love, in marriage, in rumor could change your place in the world overnight. Picture a city of stone walls and ringing bells. The market hums, and behind it stands a hall where disputes are tried. Their testimonies concern not land or theft, but whether a union is valid, because the law tied property, inheritance, and alliances to the success of a marriage. Officials, sometimes physicians or midwives, were called to observe, to conclude, to write. They did not use today's science. They used the tools their age offered: observation, tradition, and a determination to protect the social order. The language of the records is restrained, even clinical, but beneath the ink you can feel the pressure. Families worried about dowries, partnerships balanced on a verdict, futures decided in measured phrases. And if the legal chamber wasn't daunting enough, consider the first night of a noble wedding. You might imagine music, candles, and a closed door. Instead, the ritual could be semi-public, prayers spoken, curtains drawn, witnesses nearby to attest that the alliance had truly begun. This wasn't spectacle for spectacle's sake. It was politics. A marriage united houses, quieted borderlands, settled debts between kingdoms. Without proof, heirs might be challenged, treaties might falter, and decades later, lawyers would still be arguing over what did or didn't happen. So people watched or listened or inspected signs the next morning, not to revel in gossip, but to prevent future wars of words, and sometimes wars of armies. The church deepened this paradox. Spiritual leaders condemned excess, yet managed vast economies. Cathedrals required money, bishops oversaw lands, markets, and rights. Moral instruction lived side by side with administration, and the line between guidance and governance could blur. Even medicine joined the chorus. Physicians, drawing on ancient theories, believed cooperation between partners wasn't merely pleasant. It was necessary for conception. Advice books spoke in careful tones about compatibility, warmth, and balance, framing private harmony as a matter of health, not indulgence. None of this is to shock you with lurid detail. It's to show the machinery that made intimacy public: law, ritual, theology, and medicine working together to keep society predictable. When everything depended on heirs and alliances, the community felt entitled to confirm what today we reserve for two people alone. That's the core truth of the medieval world. Not cruelty for its own sake, but certainty at any cost. As we continue, keep that in mind. And if you appreciate peeling back the curtain on how people truly lived, stay with us and consider supporting more journeys like this by subscribing. The next step is darker, stranger, and closer to our modern lives than you might expect. Imagine standing in that chamber. The walls are cold stone, the windows narrow slits that let in only a pale light. Rows of benches line the space, filled not with curious onlookers, but with officials who believe they are safeguarding the moral and social fabric of their world. Before them stands an accused man, not accused of theft or betrayal, but of failing in the most private of duties. His entire future rests on the verdict, and yet the decision is shaped not by compassion, but by legal necessity. The record keepers are ready, quills sharpened, every gesture to be inscribed as evidence for generations. What for us is unthinkable was, for them, an accepted part of justice. The examinations weren't merely symbolic, they were methodical. Selected midwives or physicians carried the responsibility of judging capability. To them, this was not scandalous. It was civic duty. They believed their observations preserved truth and prevented fraud. Families pressed for these procedures because wealth, dowries, and inheritances depended on outcomes. If a union could not produce heirs, lands might revert to another branch, alliances might collapse, and entire communities might face uncertainty. One person's humiliation was, in the eyes of the court, the community's insurance policy. This climate produced stories that feel haunting even now. In one case, a man endured repeated investigations because his wife insisted on more proof. Each time, the ordeal became heavier, not because of what was done, but because of the pressure to succeed under watchful eyes. Anxiety alone could ruin reputations. Failure was not always physical, it was psychological, compounded by the awareness that one's most personal abilities were being judged as though they were property deeds. Families on both sides would sit anxiously, knowing fortunes might be won or lost by the words written that day. Marriage was not just affection, it was economy, alliance, obligation. And for the church, it was a sacrament that required certainty. The theology of the time held that union was incomplete without physical confirmation, and so courts insisted on evidence. From this perspective, the trials were not cruelty. They were safeguards against deception, tools to uphold canon law and maintain stability. What strikes us as invasive struck them as rational. Yet the records reveal the toll. Men fainting from fear, women pleading for annulment, scribes coldly documenting outcomes with phrases that reduced human lives to clinical notations. We live in a world where privacy is considered a right. Doctors close the door. Courts do not interfere in bedrooms, but in the medieval imagination, privacy did not exist in the same way. Life was communal. Reputations were collective, and private failure meant public consequences. Looking back, it is hard not to feel gratitude for the barriers we now take for granted. When intimacy is private, it belongs to those involved alone. In the next chapter, however, we'll see that the public eye extended even further, into the very heart of weddings, where the first night itself became a matter of state. And that tradition reveals just how entangled love, politics, and spectacle truly were. Now picture the wedding of a noble family. The air is thick with incense, the hall filled with laughter, music, and the clinking of cups. Yet behind the joy lies a tension few couples today could imagine. For the bride and groom, their union is not only personal but political. The feast may celebrate love, but the true purpose is alliance. And because so much rested on this bond, the most private moment of all, the first night, was treated not as a secret but as evidence. Curtains drawn, prayers spoken, officials present to ensure that what mattered most to kingdoms and dynasties had truly taken place. For us, this feels unthinkable. The idea of witnesses lingering nearby while two young people attempted to begin their marriage seems like an intrusion beyond measure. But to medieval society, it was a safeguard. Without proof, the marriage could be challenged. Children born later might be declared illegitimate. Dowries could be reclaimed, treaties dissolved, and wars sparked by questions of inheritance. Witnesses were, in their eyes, guardians of peace. It was not curiosity that brought them to the chamber, but duty, though one can only imagine the discomfort felt by the young couple at the center of it all. Rituals reinforced the spectacle. Families undressed the bride and groom, not in secret but with ceremony, each garment removed to the sound of jokes and commentary. Guests accompanied the couple to the chamber, sometimes tossing symbolic gifts meant to encourage fertility, sometimes laughing at the awkwardness of it all. The bed itself was blessed. Prayers whispered for strength and fruitful union. Curtains were drawn, but they were thin, and ears were keen. What should have been tender became performance, and the audience waited for signs, sounds, movement, or tokens the next day that would verify success. Mourning brought its own trials. Sheets might be displayed to assembled guests, proof paraded through halls as if announcing victory. Midwives might be called to confirm the bride's condition, swearing oaths that carried legal weight. These were not empty gestures. They were binding evidence, recorded and preserved, shaping the legitimacy of dynasties. In cases where no proof could be offered, the couple was expected to try again. Sometimes the ritual repeated for days, weeks, even years, while rumors spread and pressure mounted. The toll on those involved was immense. Young brides, often barely teenagers, were thrust into a spotlight they could not refuse. Grooms, too, bore the crushing weight of expectation, knowing their performance determined not only their marriage, but the stability of nations. What we call anxiety today was, for them, a matter of state. To falter was not only personal failure, but political disaster. And yet families and officials pressed forward, convinced that without such measures, chaos might reign. To us, these customs seem invasive, even cruel. But to medieval minds, they were the only way to ensure certainty in a world where bloodlines and alliances carried the weight of kingdoms. What strikes us as humiliation struck them as necessity, and though centuries separate us, the echoes remain in the pressure placed on weddings, in the expectations surrounding marriage, in the idea that private moments must prove something to the world. The stage was never empty, even in the bedroom, and from this stage we move to another contradiction, the church itself, where voices of morality often hid business empires that told a very different story. The paradox of the medieval world becomes sharpest when we look at the role of the church. From the pulpit, bishops thundered against sin, warning their congregations of the dangers of excess and indulgence. They spoke of purity, restraint, and the sanctity of marriage. Yet behind the cathedral doors, a very different story unfolded. Some of the same leaders who preached morality managed sprawling businesses that drew profit from the very practices they condemned. Cathedrals were grand and costly, armies needed funding, and the faithful expected magnificent processions. To meet those demands, bishops often turned to enterprises that blurred the line between morality and money. In London, for example, the Bishop of Winchester oversaw a district known for its bustling houses of entertainment. Far from being hidden, these establishments operated openly, with signs, records, and taxes that fed directly into the bishop's treasury. Official stamps were issued, inspections were conducted, and fees were collected with bureaucratic precision. The income funded sacred spaces, repaired churches, and even financed charity. The hypocrisy is obvious to modern eyes. Sermons about virtue were literally paid for by the profits of indulgence. Yet for medieval society, there was no contradiction. A bishop was not only a spiritual leader but also a landlord, tax collector, and political figure. To them, economic activity, whatever its form, was simply part of governance. This intertwining of morality and commerce reveals much about the era. The church did not stand apart from society. It was society. Its leaders were administrators, judges, and financiers. They were expected to manage revenue streams, just as kings managed armies. If that meant taxing activities they preached against, so be it. Better, they reasoned, to regulate and profit than to leave matters ungoverned. By controlling these enterprises, bishops claimed to prevent worse harms, insisting that structure and oversight protected the community from chaos. Records from across Europe show how widespread this was. Taxes were meticulously logged, profits counted, and investments made. Some districts built entire economies around these enterprises, with regulations, protection services, and even retirement systems for workers. The revenue could be staggering, enough to raise new churches, fund festivals, and maintain the lavish lifestyles of clerical elites. It was not scandal hidden in shadows. It was an institution proudly stamped with coats of arms and recorded in ledgers. And yet, this contradiction left its mark. Councils debated the ethics of such practices. Reformers protested. But time and again, efforts to ban clerical involvement failed. The economic reality was too powerful. Cathedrals did not build themselves. Wars did not fund themselves. And so the paradox continued. Sermons on purity financed by enterprises of indulgence, morality tied to money, spirituality entangled with commerce. It is a reminder that power often justifies its own contradictions, finding ways to balance appearance and necessity. For us, the lesson is striking. We often imagine the Church of the Middle Ages as an untouchable moral authority, but it was also a business, deeply enmeshed in the practical needs of its time. This dual identity, sacred and economic, shows how medieval people lived with contradictions that would tear modern institutions apart. And as strange as it seems, those contradictions shaped the very spaces where prayers echoed, hymns rose, and stained glass windows glowed with holy light. From this tangle of piety and profit, another dimension emerges, the realm of medicine, where theories of health turned private intimacy into a matter of public concern. Medieval medicine carried its own strange weight in this story. Physicians, trained in universities and steeped in the writings of ancient authorities, believed that harmony in marriage was not only desirable, but essential for health. Their theories insisted that both partners had roles to play and that true conception required balance and cooperation. It wasn't spoken of in terms of romance or affection. It was framed as medical necessity. Doctors prescribed methods, foods, and rituals with the seriousness of treatment, convinced that without proper fulfillment, families would fail to produce heirs and society itself could weaken. Guides circulated in learned circles described in careful, clinical language how couples might overcome difficulties. Oils were recommended to warm the body, diets adjusted to balance the humors, and certain rhythms of life prescribed to encourage compatibility. To modern eyes, these instructions read almost like intimacy manuals. To medieval people, they were medicine, meant to ensure the continuation of households, dynasties, and communities. Midwives, too, became key figures, offering advice, observing outcomes, and serving as a bridge between theory and practice. What we might call privacy today was then a matter of public concern, addressed with treatments written in the same books that taught surgery or herbal remedies. But not all treatments were safe. Without modern science, some remedies relied on guesswork and inherited tradition. Herbal concoctions, exotic powders, and curious devices were all recommended with the belief that they could restore balance. Some worked mildly, others carried hidden risks, and still others were dangerous. Yet for people desperate for children, for families counting on heirs, the risks seemed worth taking. The choice was stark: try what was offered, or face the shame and consequences of a union that failed in its most basic expectation. Medicine and morality intertwined, creating a world where the body was never just the body. It was property, promise, and proof. Beyond treatment, there were also attempts to avoid conception, equally fraught with peril. Women and men alike experimented with methods handed down through whispered traditions and written manuscripts. Some remedies were simple, others complex, many unreliable. A few were based on genuine observation, others rooted in superstition, but all reflected the same truth. Control over fertility was an urgent need, and people would risk much to achieve it. These attempts reveal both the ingenuity and desperation of medieval life, a world where every choice carried consequences that reached far beyond the individual. Even love itself was subject to strange experiments. Recipes for charms and potions filled manuscripts, promising affection or loyalty if the right steps were taken. Sometimes harmless, sometimes unsettling, they show how deeply people longed for control in matters of the heart. To modern readers, these rituals may seem fantastical, even grotesque, but behind them lies a very human desire to be loved, to secure stability, to avoid loneliness. In a society where options were limited, people turned to whatever tools they believed might give them power, even if those tools came wrapped in mystery. And then there were punishments. Adultery, more than personal betrayal, was treated as a wound to the community itself. In some towns, humiliating rituals turned private failure into public spectacle, ensuring that everyone saw the consequences of stepping outside the lines. Crowds gathered, bells rang, and reputations were destroyed in a matter of hours. What for us would be handled quietly in private was, for them, a civic performance meant to restore balance. These rituals might seem cruel, but they were understood as necessary purges, reminders that the stability of the group outweighed the dignity of the individual. Looking back across these layers, courts that judge personal ability, weddings transformed into public proofs, bishops balancing morality with profit, doctors prescribing harmony as medicine, and communities punishing betrayal, it becomes clear just how different their world was from ours. Privacy, choice, and confidentiality are things we take for granted, but they are modern inventions. The medieval world made every aspect of life a matter of public interest. To live then was to be watched, judged, and recorded in ways we can barely imagine. And yet, across centuries, the core human themes remain. The longing for connection, the fear of rejection, the desire for control over one's life and family, the weight of social expectation. These are not medieval problems, they are human ones. What changes are the methods, not the emotions. That's why these stories feel both alien and familiar. They remind us that while society evolves, the heart remains the same. So, if you've found yourself drawn into this strange past, consider staying with us for more journeys into the forgotten corners of history. Because what we uncover there has the power to make us grateful for the freedoms we enjoy, and cautious about the ways we still let others judge what should be private.